And welcome back, everybody. Another edition here of the Auburn Undercover podcast on the 24/7 Sports Network. My name is Nathan King. Welcome into the pregame pod, where weekly we get, of course, the opposition's insight on Auburn's next opponent. The Tigers are going to Baton Rouge for Game 3 of SEC play after their bye week, and we have a fantastic sister site over there at Go 24/7, the LSU coverage, of course, on the 24/7 Sports Network. And he's joined us a couple times on the show in the past. So we are bringing back Mr. Bryce Coon. You guys can follow him on Twitter at Bryce_Coon. Bryce, we were talking, on your podcast yesterday as we're recording this here on Wednesday. It is sad to think about the fact that, A, this is a game that it's not going to be played next year. But B, I love going to Baton Rouge. It's my third time in Tiger Stadium. I have no idea when I'm going to go back after next year. It's just a bizarre feeling for a game that, for I guess almost 3 decades has been a yearly thing for these division opponents.
Yeah, and one of the big things, Nathan, that LSU fans will tell you, I mean, there's an assortment of rivalries, but this game, and we talked about it yesterday, it's always got this weird and wacky stuff. So it's a game that I think is really going to be missed. And, you mentioned you love coming to Baton Rouge. Well, being down here in Baton Rouge, I'm going to miss coming to Auburn because that's 20 minutes away from family, me being from Columbus, Georgia, right there, kind of in that Auburn Tiger fan base. So, yeah, I mean, I'm going to cherish the game that we have on Saturday night. And like we kind of alluded to, last week or yesterday on our podcast, look, a Saturday night in Death Valley, if we've got to go out with a bang, why not go out with, one of the better atmospheres in college football?
Yeah, and like you mentioned, it's always a weird game. Traditionally, it's always, regardless of really how these two teams have done, it's always a close game. Brian Kelly said today, the more he's been looking at the matchup, LSU's an 11.5-point favorite, that he thinks this is going to be a close game. He sort of made the prediction today. He said, yeah, I think Auburn will be in it in the fourth quarter. He just went out and said it, and history would tell him he's correct. 7 of the last 8 matchups between these teams have been decided by 5 points or fewer. The only exception there is 2020, where Auburn didn't have a great team that year. That's when they fired Gus Malzahn, but LSU went to Jordan-Hare and just got absolutely hammered in that game. Obviously, the year after they won the national title, but really, traditionally, it hasn't mattered what trajectory either team is on in this matchup. You can look no further than the 2019 game when, of course, that is arguably the greatest offense in the history of our sport. They had their worst game against Auburn. I remember Kevin Steele had a fantastic game plan. They had like 2 down linemen. They only put Marlon Davidson and Derek Brown on the line. That was it. They were like, we're going to drop everybody else back and kind of play it like an air raid. And they almost went into Baton Rouge and won that game. And so we'll see. This is obviously going to be a great chess match on Saturday as well. Because talking about that 2019 team, Hugh Freeze said this week, look, this is the best offensive personnel I have seen in my time coaching the SEC. Now, of course, he was at Liberty when LSU was making that run to the championship in 2019, but he's probably not wrong. You've got a couple other contenders there, but it starts with Jaden Daniels and his receiving talent and what he has done in the passing game. Just sort of walk us through, I think everybody watched that Florida State game, and it was clunky on both ends. Florida State came out and played a fantastic game and really sort of sent a message there in week 1. What has Jaden Daniels done, though, this season? Not only progressing in these few games, but look, when Auburn saw him last year, he wasn't very good at all. He's like 8 of 20 when they played in Jordan-Hare. What has he done in terms of his progression in 2 years as LSU's quarterback, getting to where now, I agree with you. You said it the other day on your podcast, he may be the best quarterback in the country right now.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly playing like it, and I think there's a case for, obviously it depends on team success, but you could make a case this kid needs to be in New York with the way that he's played. So, I think the biggest thing when it comes to Jaden Daniels is you have a guy that, like you mentioned last year, in this game, I believe he had like 80 or 90 passing yards in this game. I mean, it was an effort that, they really had to run the ball. John Emery, Daniels had to run the ball, that kind of thing, for them to get back in that football game. It's been a progression thing. It's been I think, though, unlocking the mental side of saying, you know what, I got a good deep ball. I can throw the ball around the yard a little bit. And now you've really got a group of receivers that is really starting to make the mark. Not that they didn't have it, because look, Malik Neighbors was still on the roster. But I think, LSU fans are, we can all say that Kayshon Boutte was a guy that really didn't live up to what he needed to in his final season down here in Baton Rouge. And I mean, the best of luck to him in New England and everything he has going on. But that being said, Brian Thomas Jr., his emergence has helped Jaden, immensely. Mason Taylor, the tight end, who everyone remembers the catch against Alabama to win it in overtime. But, that's a really, really dynamic player that should be, 100% for the first time since the Florida State game, coming into this football game. That's going to be a big weapon. But I think overall, it's really mentally because Daniels, I remember when he was at Arizona State and the game where he throws the deep ball. And Nathan, I don't know if you remember watching this against Oregon to upset Oregon and knock them out of the playoff. I believe that was his true freshman year, which was 2019. All, we kind of cyclical effect here that we're talking about with this 2019 offense. But Daniels has always possessed that arm talent. He's always possessed the physical gifts to be an elite quarterback in college football. I think, the mental side, being able to progress through his reads. Last year, he really honed in on Neighbors as the season continued, and especially after this Auburn game last season. And you could see it was Neighbors and put my eyes down and go. That was kind of what Daniels did. And look, it was hard to fault him. I mean, LSU played for an SEC championship. They won double-digit games in year one under Brian Kelly. It's hard to fault him. The difference this season, though, is progressing through the reads, working from left to right. He's even said that and trusting, the instincts of saying, look, I've got the God-given talent. Now let's go prove that on the field. And so that's been one big thing. And then I'll add this. You and I were texting about, what teams have been able to do to kind of slow him down a little bit. And I mentioned to you, said, hey, go watch the first half against Arkansas. The biggest difference for Daniels was last year when he struggled, it lingered. This year, when he has struggled outside of the Florida State game, he's turned it around. The Arkansas game might be the biggest example of that. They score on the final drive, and then they don't. They can't keep them, off the board. Arkansas's defense can't until the game's over. Like the clock literally had to stop for LSU to stop scoring. So, the ability to flip the switch, what I think also goes into the mental component. So I really attribute to the maturity, the mental fortitude of what Daniels has used and really be able to that bounce back mentality.
That being said, about that Arkansas game, Florida State, of course, did a good job. We'll kind of stick here and continue talking about Daniels. What have teams done this season, whether it's, we talked about it on your podcast. It's tough to just ask you to go out and have Florida State's talent. Like nobody's going to really have that on defense. No one's going to have, not many teams are going to have their kind of defensive front. But there have been spots in other games, really not an entire game, but quarters, maybe a couple drives at a time. What have teams done to get him out of a rhythm? What have they done to these receivers? Because Auburn, as we talked about on your show, they've got pieces and they've actually, they've executed pretty well here early in the season under Ron Roberts. So it feels like maybe they would have some tools to possibly replicate that and try to slow him down.
Yeah, I mean, look, we just got done recording our preview podcast for the game, and I did mention, look, Auburn has spots on their roster where you say that could be a mismatch in Auburn's favor. That they could take advantage of this. I really go back to that first half against Arkansas, and I shot you that text yesterday, and then I went back and watched it. The ability to disrupt him off of his timing, going to the mental side of thing, Daniels is very much relies on the mental clock. You watch him, progress through his reads. If he's got Neighbors on his left side and he ends with Thomas on his right, one thing that Arkansas was able to do is never let him get to the right side. So if that first read wasn't open, depending on what type of coverage, I mean, a lot of times they would, Arkansas, for example, would try to bracket Malik Neighbors wherever he was on that side of the field and then say, okay, we're going to load up on front and we're not even going to let him get to his second reads because that's what we saw last year that he was accustomed to doing. And look, as well as I do, when you have quarterback problems or offensive line problems, a lot of times the mental clock really gets messed up for a quarterback. And so Arkansas was able to do that. And even when they weren't running that specific type of scheme or that specific type of play, it caused Daniels to kind of revert back to those old habits. So, I think for this game, if Auburn can find a way, whether it's a guy like, DJ James, who we talked about, or any of these players that Auburn has a veteran secondary, and, I mentioned on our show, I love Kyan Lee. Like, I absolutely love what that kid's made of. If they can find a way to try to take away one of these receivers and generate enough pass rush up front to disrupt them, you could see Daniels revert back to the bad habits. That's one thing that LSU fans on our board have pointed out. Like that's what Arkansas was able to do. And I'll point it out, like Arkansas is on a slide right now, but they've got a good defensive front. And they showed that coming into Baton Rouge, quieting this group, the crowd of this group very quickly. You guys got like Marcus Harris. We talked about some other names as well up front. I mean, I do think that there is a way for Auburn to do this. It's just a matter of executing. It's way easier said than done because if you allow, and this is what happened in that second half, that bracket coverage, neighbors started to break it. The halftime adjustments by this offensive staff was able to utilize some different things. After that, man, it was really, really hard. And I'll add into this the emergence of Logan Diggs, which LSU really didn't have last year in this game. They didn't have Diggs on the roster, but not really a solid running game. I mean, I remember Emory had a nice night at, in Jordan Hare, but that just takes a load off of Daniels and the ability to run the football. So I would say you really got to go back and watch that Arkansas game, what they're able to do, because we mentioned there's no Jared Verse on this Auburn roster. There's no Braden Fisk up front. You don't have Florida State's dudes. That's just and no one else really does. So Arkansas to me had a nice half against Daniels. It's just, can you sustain that? And offensively, which I'm sure we'll talk about, can you take advantage when LSU does get into that lull?
Yeah, you're talking about the defensive side of the ball there for LSU. That's such a big matchup in this game as well because it feels like an either or situation because LSU's had a lot of problems defensively. They've allowed a lot of teams to have some of their better games of the season. This is an Auburn offense that is coming out of a bye week, is feeling like they haven't been great early in the year. I mean, there's been a lot of problems in the passing game. You can't put it all on the quarterback, but Peyton Thorne has still yet to throw for 100 yards against a Power 5 team. They don't have a bunch of receiving yards on the season. Their offensive line has been shaky at times. This is an Auburn team, though, that feels like they did some good things against Georgia and can kind of build on that. How optimistic are you in this game from the LSU perspective that they can have a good game plan to slow down Auburn and kind of, push away some of their issues that they've had? Because to their credit, you look at when they played Mississippi State. I know that's an offense that's in flux and that lot of issues there, but they had a really good game. And then against Missouri, if they don't tweak some things on defense, you wrote a story about it today about them changing some alignment along their defensive front. If they don't do that against Missouri and get some stops when they needed to, they don't go in there and win that game. And so it's an LSU defense that has a lot of talent, but just from the outside looking in, hasn't been very consistent this year.
Yeah, they haven't been very consistent, and that's exactly where I was going to go. Wrote the piece today that encouraged, if you're an Auburn fan wanting to know what this LSU defense looks like, go and check that over at Go 24/7. They have really simplified things, Nathan. I mean, 2 weeks ago in the game against Ole Miss, Brian Kelly said in his Monday availability, we are going absolutely basic. Like, he didn't hide it. Lane Kiffin knew it from the press conference. There was nothing, that you had to read in between the lines, and they still couldn't, stop Ole Miss. So going into Missouri week, that was a concern of mine. If we just saw as basic as it gets, I'm really worried. Like, I don't know if you can stop anybody because that didn't do well. They missed 30 tackles per PFF for 285 yards after contact against Ole Miss. I mean, that's not a winning formula for anybody. So going into the Missouri game, it was a lot of the same thing, but the biggest transition has been the true four-man front. And so we had the chance to talk with Sage Ryan and Jacobian Guillory last night at player availability. Defensive lineman is a Guillory, Sage Ryan, one of the cornerbacks that we'll talk about. And Ryan mentioned, and Guillory both did, that it's not like it's entirely different with that jack position, that jack linebacker. He's just rushing the quarterback more often. So traditionally, they did technically have a four down front, but what they were doing is the jack would have so many different assignments that they didn't dedicate him purely to getting after the quarterback. Now, that second half against Missouri, you saw, I think they only allowed 2 third downs the entire second half. Missouri really struggled. They didn't convert 1 third down in the fourth quarter. So maybe they found something going so basic here that says, look, we're just going to let our athletes play ball. I think it says a lot of different things. I think it says, off the field wise recruiting, you got to get some better football players on the defensive side of the football that can do some more, maybe potentially complex things. But as for the roster construction right now, I mean, Nathan, it's no secret that the secondary had 4 guys with any playing experience travel to Missouri. That was something that was a major concern. And it's a major concern in this game for me, as well. Even though Thorne is only completing it's around 50% of his passes in SEC play. So it's not a dynamic Auburn attack, but the lack of ability to tackle consistently and letting up big plays. I mean, I joked about this with you earlier. 3rd and 11 for this defense oftentimes might as well be 3rd and 2. it's just it's like it's too much ground to cover. They'd much rather just load the box on 3rd and 2 and try to stop you. So, I think Auburn can have some success, especially if they establish the run early. And LSU's not tackling well. I mean, that's something that I think could open up some things for Peyton Thorne. And then to go off what you mentioned about Mississippi State, Brian Kelly was very candid about this post game in Starkville. He said, "Look, we feel like as a roster, as a group up front, we're as talented as anybody in the country." And I would echo that sentiment. When you look at the 24/7 composite rankings of the kids that came in, it's there. The back end, not so much, but the front is. Against non-mobile quarterbacks, we've seen they've been very, very good. I mean, Will Rogers is not a guy that moves around a ton, but what they're able to do, what they're unable to do against mobile quarterbacks has been the problem. A guy like Jordan Travis, that you have to respect the front run. Even a kid that was a transfer down to Grambling State, he gave them, absolute hell on defense for about a half. So I think one of the storylines in asking some of the players is how do you combat Thorne and Ashford in this? Because, and I said this yesterday, Thorne's willingness to run the football adds a different dynamic for this Auburn offense that I think they really needed to know about themselves before they even got into this game.
Yeah, it absolutely does. You could kind of see that confidence growing with him against Georgia. He had a really big run early in the game, and we all kind of said up in the press box, like, okay, this is definitely what he needed. Because I wanted to kind of quickly jump to another question I had about the defensive line, and it's something I think is a big key in this game. I'm just wondering how much, because we saw them go on the road to Texas A&M, and their offense was and your comment about non-mobile quarterbacks, I think, is going to scare Auburn fans a little bit, because Thorne is mobile, but his pocket presence and his ability to escape from that pressure, not great against Texas A&M. It wasn't great against Georgia either. More of his stuff was on designed runs. How much do you think this LSU defensive line is capable of maybe managing that part of the game and creating a lot of issues up front? Because I have this sort of like pessimistic view of what could happen for Auburn's offense. It's they go into a road spot. We've just seen this over the years when their offensive line hasn't been great. They go into a road spot. They're a little shaky. They don't have a super talented quarterback, and the game just gets blown up from there. Like the offensive line knows they can't really block anybody. The quarterback knows he doesn't have a ton of time, and you just can't really get a consistent offense going. It sounds like they have the talent to do it. How capable do you think LSU is of maybe accomplishing that or coming close to accomplishing that?
Yeah, once again, Nathan, I go back to the second half against Missouri where we saw a guy like Mason Smith start to really, he's physically, healed from the ACL injury a year ago that he suffered against Florida State in the opener down in New Orleans. But mentally, you're starting to see, look, a 300-pound plus guy is always going to be worried about getting rolled up on, and especially when you're coming off an ACL injury. He was a big part of that. He had a couple tackles for loss and a sack in that game and a couple quarterback pressures. His emergence kind of in this 3 technique spot they've had him playing a couple sequences, I guess you could say, against Missouri, along with a veteran like Mekhi Wingo, who's just a workhorse down there in the trenches. And look, we can't forget about Harold Perkins. I mean, the guy's playing everything from nickel corner. I don't know if you saw that in Brian Kelly's. He's playing like nickel corner now to playing, he's going to come up front. A young player like Whit Weeks, who just plays with his hair on fire, playing in the inside. I mean, when you look at this front seven, the talent is there. Before Missouri, I was going to be concerned. After Missouri, I don't want to go as far as saying I think they can dominate, but I do see a path, like you said, where knowing Auburn, knowing some of the struggles they could have up front, I do think that this is a matchup that favors LSU because it's a game one, like we said, you get back in front of the home crowd. This team has played 2 home games in the first 7 weeks of the season. They're going to play the next 5 out of their next 6 inside Tiger Stadium. That has been something they're going to feed off the crowd. We know defensively more than offensively, you're able to do that. Auburn fans know that more than anyone, with the atmosphere they have over there at Jordan-Hare. So I do think this is a matchup that favors LSU. It's just going to be about execution because they have the talent, but at times this talent has kind of disappeared when it's needed the most. Ole Miss being one of those teams that I think is a little more similar to what Auburn can do maybe than a Missouri. I think Jackson Dart's the better quarterback, obviously, but kind of when you look at the schematically, some of the things that Hugh Freeze could dial up, and it's going to be interesting. I mean, Auburn's offensive line has a tough task, but Mason Smith, Mekhi Wingo, Guillory, A guy like Jordan Jefferson, transfer from West Virginia. These guys have really kind of taken a step up in the violence that they play with up front. And I think that has led them to be more effective against a team like Missouri that, up until that point in the season had looked pretty good offensive line wise, and Brady Cook had been pretty comfortable.
Yeah, you mentioned, needing to just go out and execute. Auburn's defense on the other end. Again, it just feels like, this isn't, I don't know if this is as monumental a task as Georgia. I think Georgia's definitely a better team than LSU. Maybe not definitely. I think they're probably a better team than LSU, but this spot is on the road. Can the bye week maybe offset some of that? Can you execute a little better? There's just so many factors that go into this game that make me think that this number of a double digit spread is a little bit high. I just maybe would personally think that this is going to be another kind of close game down the stretch where, again, you mentioned it along the defensive line there. If this is a game that just gets blown up from the beginning, I would struggle to see Auburn finding consistent offense, even though they have had the ability to run the ball. But at the same time, if they kind of go with the Ole Miss approach, if they go fast, if Thorne gets a couple completions early in the game to get some confidence, if they get better wide receiver play and start bringing up that tempo, now, like you said, you kind of put that LSU defense on its back heels. You make them revert to some things, and all of a sudden that talent can't win as often as maybe it could in just a one-on-one setting. Before we get you out of here, Bryce, maybe things that we've talked about so far, maybe things we haven't talked about. What are one or two factors in this game that you're looking at and saying, okay, if LSU accomplishes this and back in front of its home crowd, they probably are going to be able to get away with a win here. Or if they don't accomplish these things, Auburn's going to have a chance to, like Brian Kelly theorized, make it a 4-quarter game and have a chance to go in there and get a win.
Yeah, I've got kind of two positions that I think are going to be really, really key in this. One, and I mentioned a name earlier, Whit Weeks, the true freshman linebacker out of Watkinsville, Georgia. The LSU linebackers, because we talk about the front and everyone thinks, oh, yeah, your front four, your Mason Smith, your Mekhi Wingos, all the names that we've mentioned. But the linebacker position that has been something at LSU this season that we thought coming in was going to be a veteran and a veteran matchup, a Harold Penn or a Greg Penn, well, actually a Harold Perkins because they had him inside at linebacker, and a guy like Omar Spates transferred from Oregon State that was all Pac-12. And 6 weeks in, we now have Greg Penn, a guy who is we call him an LSU lifer just because he's been here, for more than 1 year at this point with how crazy the transfer portal is. And Whit Weeks, who's the true freshman, those guys got to step up. You go back to that Ole Miss game, it was a game where Quinshon Judkins was able to really break out. The running game ran wild against this front, and there was a lot of over pursuit from the linebackers. Even when the defensive line would win their one-on-ones, too often we saw some of these linebackers really just kind of getting swept into the mix. And so then you leave one-on-one chances, by that time your running back is running 6, 7, 8 yards untouched. That's something that I think has to play in the part here because watch enough Auburn football, no, Jarquez Hunter's a physical guy. I mean, he's not going to shy away from contact. I love the play of Brian Battie, the compliment that he brings with Hunter. All those things being said, I think that the linebacker play for LSU has to be a key. If they are filling gaps correctly, and like Brian Kelly has mentioned so many times, not trying to do everyone else's job, but do theirs, they can have success and they could win this football game. And another one that you mentioned, it's going to be Auburn's receivers. I don't want to get Auburn fans hoped up too much in this sense because they'll come back after the fact and be like, you lied to us, Bryce. But what I will say is this is probably the worst group of Power 5 cornerbacks that they'll face. So, or maybe face. I mean, I don't think that's too far-fetched being able to say. So if there is a game for guys to have just a game to show, and you and I mentioned this on yesterday's podcast on our channel, just to have a game where you can show some life out of a couple of guys at the receiver position, this is going to be it. So I think that's going to be something. The LSU cornerbacks against this Auburn receivers both haven't really been outstanding. So something's got to give. Like something has to give here on Saturday night. So I think that's going to be another one that's really going to determine kind of the outcome of this ball game.
Yeah, and so much of this RPO system for Auburn relies on guys making plays in space. And we're not, or excuse me, making plays in coverage. And we're not just talking about going and getting a jump ball. It's such a quick read that most of the time the DB is kind of still draping on you. And that's why Jay Fair has emerged as their best receivers because he's had such consistent hands. And so if the cornerback play isn't as good, maybe a guy like Shane Hooks, who's a big Jackson State transfer, but has really struggled to kind of high point the ball and make his physicality felt. Camden Brown is a Louisiana guy. who's a really big physical player. Nick Mardner is 6'6". Maybe, like you said, if this is a weaker group of corners, maybe these guys on the outside can actually go up and get the ball. Whereas against Georgia, Hugh Freeze said there were about 5 or 6 throws by Thorne that not drops, but should have been caught because they were good throws, and the receiver the receiver has to be a playmaker. Receiver
Yeah.
has to box out the
Yeah.
DB and make a playmaker. And so if he replicates that, if he has those same kinds of throws, maybe they have a better chance because it's, Georgia's secondary at this point is definitely better than LSU's. We'll be posting this on Friday morning, Bryce. So I don't know, the predictions will probably be out from y'all's side by then. But what's your prediction for this game if you have a score prediction at this point? And I guess just how do you see this one playing out on Saturday?
Well, Nathan, I'll warn the Auburn fans watching, if you try to check the score predictions that I choose, it's one of those things where I change my score prediction on every single show I do. So it's never consistent. When we post ours on Friday, I guess that's like my final one. But this one's recording on Wednesday. If the spread stays at 11.5, I'll say this. I'm a little bit biased, and I'll, in the sense of, I've watched a lot of Auburn football. Like I mentioned, grew up in the Columbus, Georgia area, went to a lot of games as a kid. I know what this Auburn team can be. I know they're a team that they can play well above themselves at times, like they did in the Georgia game, well above the talent level. This game is just way too wacky for me to feel comfortable taking that 11 points for LSU. And so my final score prediction, I think this is one that I'll end up sticking with. I had LSU winning this one 31-23, but I do think it's a game where, this is going to be a game midway through the third quarter into the fourth quarter. Maybe LSU goes up 31, 16, 31-17 in the fourth quarter, and Auburn gets a late touchdown to make it look closer. But I do think that this is a game where I don't expect a blowout on either side. And just because of that, Nathan, watch it happen. That's how weird this game has been in years past. But I do kind of think that's where this sits. I think Auburn is a talented team. They've got good pieces, and just knowing what the Auburn brand is, knowing what it is, I don't think they're going to come in and fall flat in front of a crowd that, look, I might get some heat if LSU fans watch this. And I guess I'm just trying to interview for a job, Nathan, at this point. Jordan Hare is, to me, so far, every bit as crazy at times in some games I've been to in there. And so I think that they're used to playing in raucous environments. It's going to be a fun one. But I do have LSU winning in a close one. But I know Auburn fans don't want to see another moral victory, but I think there might be some things you can take out of this game and say, look, we're building, and we have to remember the 30,000-foot view of this. And that's really, I think, where Auburn is as a program here in 2023.
Yeah, it was interesting. It's fun to talk to. They've got so many transfers on this team. Talked to a few guys yesterday who came from a group of 5 schools. You got a linebacker from North Texas, so he's got a bunch of family that's going to come in town. He was like, this easily is going to be, the biggest environment I've played in terms of a night game.
Yeah.
Brian Battie comes from USF. He played a game at Florida, but it just didn't feel the same as a night game in Baton Rouge. And so those guys are, saying, hey, this is the reason you come to Auburn, is because you watch these games as a kid growing up. And then you want to go, you want to have an opportunity to play in them. And so, but the common thread, like you mentioned, all of those guys said, yeah, we've heard how great it's going to be. Like we're really excited, but they all said it's going to be a high bar to clear with what they had against Georgia the last week. And so they already have experienced a good SEC environment there. And so we were kind of telling them, hey, wait till next week when you get Ole Miss at night. That kind of cranks up the crazy a little bit. Just wait for that one. So I know everybody I've talked to about this game, Hugh Freeze included, has been talking about how excited he is for this one to kick off. It's always great between Auburn and LSU, and you never know what's going to happen. You mentioned that, we talk about how close it's going to be, and somebody's going to go blow somebody out. I just looked it up. That game, it was 48-11 in 2020. Just an absolute shellacking. TJ Finley, I think, had 4 turnovers in that game. Auburn was a 1-point favorite. I mean, that line was almost a pick. And they go in there and they win by 37. So
don't bet on this game. Here's a warning. Just don't do it. Just enjoy the game one time with your family, because this is, like you said, it's going to be back and forth and be crazy, I think.
Well, and I think that's the only – it's funny, because I mentioned 7 of the last 8 have been decided by 5 or less. 2016 is where that starts, and that was my freshman year at Auburn. So, every Auburn LSU game I've been a part of, except for that one that was a total wash, has been wild. Has had some degree of insanity to it. Even last year when it was you're down, LSU's down 17-0, and then it's oh yeah, Brian Harson's the coach, so they're going to go blow this in the in the second half. And so, if history serves, they're going to have something in store for us on Saturday. Bryce, thanks so much for joining us today. You guys can follow him on Twitter at Bryce_Coon. Go 24/7 is our LSU site. They do all kinds of great stuff. I've really enjoyed crossing over with them this week, as we do every week with our 24/7 sites. And so looking forward to the coverage they have on Saturday as well. If you guys enjoyed the show, go leave us a 5-star review. It's the number one thing that helps us out. The bumper music is by Beats by Mordecai. You guys can follow him on Twitter, SoundCloud, and Instagram. Until the next episode, we'll catch you guys later. Everybody enjoy the game. If you're heading to Louisiana, be safe. We'll see you guys there, and we'll talk to y'all soon.